Well, welcome everybody. Welcome back to the series of workshops that we're calling the Seer's Explanation, a framework or method of dealing with fundamental existential questions. I appreciate you all being back here. We had a really good time a week ago, and actually each of these 4 workshop sessions is about the same thing. It's just from a different perspective and using a different set of images to convey this idea that we're here to discuss. So, the seer's explanation, let's talk about that first. I want you to know that when I use the word seer, it's not about my seeing lights or energy or auras or anything like that. I don't see that stuff, in fact. I use the word seer to designate what happens when somebody encounters a new idea or a new way of looking at something and they go, oh, I see. I'm using the word seer in that context, and that happens to me all the time. I'll look at something in a new way for whatever reason, and I'll say, oh, I see. That's a better way, or that's an easier way of comprehending something. So let's talk about my suggestions for getting the most out of this workshop. So we talked about this last time. The first principle is leave what you already know at the door. Why do I ask you to do that? Well, the more you know about something, the more certainty you have about some aspect of life, your life, the world, whatever. The more certainty you have about it, the less open you are to a different way of looking at things. So I'm going to ask you to leave everything that you know about this topic of what the world is and how it relates to who we are as human beings. Leave all that stuff at the door. You can have it back in an hour and a half, I promise. So what you already know includes what you know about who you are and what the world out there is. So everybody knows what the world out there is, and everybody knows who they are, or what a human being is. I'm going to ask you to leave that at the door so that we can perhaps discover together a new way of looking at those things. And make an effort during this hour and a half that we're together today to see life, your life, from a very different perspective. This is not just a tweak or an adjustment of the way you look at the world or your life. It's really different. And don't judge it. Don't judge it until you see it clearly. So along the way, you may say, well, I don't know if I agree with that, or that seems kind of weird, or whatever adjective you might use. Don't judge it until you see it clearly. So, again, the seer's explanation is a framework or method of dealing with fundamental existential questions like, what is a human being? Well, so we all know what a human being is. A human being is one of these with add-ons like consciousness, like feelings, like emotions, like thoughts. But principally, this is a human being. One of these, and we all know what these look like. We all know what these need to look like and act like in order to be considered human beings. So, what is a human being is a pretty fundamental question, and it's one that's hardly ever asked. In the normal course of events, we don't ask that. We just go on what we already know about what a human being is. So what we're doing here tonight is we're beginning to explore together our culture's profound illusions. And this workshop is about finding out that we all have a worldview and that there might be another way to look at the world and ourselves. Most of us don't think about our worldview. We just look at the world how we look at it, and we look at ourselves and each other the way we do. We don't think about what that view is. And tonight we're going to do that. We're going to think about and talk about what that view is. So this particular session tonight is about that aspect of a worldview called common sense. What is it? Do we have it? And does it serve us? So I have this phrase up here, the end of common sense. Now that doesn't mean that we're no longer going to have common sense. It means we're going to look at the possibility of not relying on common sense, because we all do, and we'll see that as we go along, and then we'll consider, well, is common sense a net benefit or a net cost to us? In other words, is it worth it? So in this inquiry, we'll take a look at what everybody knows to be so. Sometimes that's called conventional wisdom or the current paradigm, and we'll use the term common sense for short. Here are two ordinary guys. We'll call them Manny and Frank. They're regular guys who have done well for themselves, and they have a common sense approach to life. What's the matter with that? Well, there's nothing the matter with that. We all have a common sense approach to life. If we didn't think it was common sense, we'd probably do it differently. So we're going to take these two guys, and they'll be sort of on the screen now and then, but we're going to use them as a reference to ordinary folks. We're not talking about professors or scholars or scientists. We're talking about ordinary folks like all of us. So common sense is very useful in everyday life. I know you all know that. And as we'll see, it's also a powerful limiting factor in realizing our dreams. But what is common sense? Why do we have it, and how do we use it? So to begin with, what do we mean by common sense? So here's a definition of the term common sense that came from Wikipedia. And there are probably other ways to express this, but this is the one that I chose. Common sense is a basic ability to perceive, understand, and judge things that are shared by or common to nearly all people, and can be reasonably be expected of nearly all people without the need for debate. So we expect each other to know the basic way of being in the world. Now, there are some people who can't function that way. We take care of those people to the best of our knowledge or ability. But I'm talking about those of us, for example, in this room, or most people that we're likely to encounter during the day. So common sense is that which requires no debate. And we don't debate it. We just operate from it. We operate with common sense as a basic notion or understanding of how to do life. So let's examine the roles common sense plays in our lives. Common sense guides our thoughts. Sometimes we use common sense as a basis to examine a new idea. If the new idea fits with what we already know, we accept it easily. If it doesn't, we regard it with suspicion or dismiss it outright. So common sense acts like a filter or a box that constrains our thoughts. So it's common sense that it's common sense for me that I can't levitate, that I can't just rise up into the air. Now, maybe there are people in far off places or far off times who have known how to do that, but it's common sense to me that we can't do that. So I never consider what might be possible if I did do that, because it's just common sense that you can't. It's maybe kind of an outlandish example, but we'll use it. So here's an example, a real world example. Most of us believe that the good things in life are in short supply. Since anything that exists as a real, tangible thing is finite, there's only so much of it to go around. It's limited, it's scarce. We all know, for example, that money, which is what's pictured here, is in short supply. How short? Well, that's all relative, but the point is it's not unlimited. If money is not infinite, if it's finite, then the idea that you have unlimited purchasing power doesn't fit within the context of money being limited, so you reject it immediately. You reject the idea that you can buy anything you want at any time. The idea that you deserve to have whatever you want doesn't fit in there either. It doesn't fit in the idea that money is a finite resource, that it's scarce. In this example, we could be talking about money, or we could be talking about the availability of potential mates or lovers, or any other resource that you consider important. Common sense says that they're all scarce. Now, if we all know that scarcity is real, then scarcity acts like a filter. Thoughts that fit with the idea of scarcity are accepted without question. Thoughts that don't fit are rejected almost immediately, and that's just common sense. So take a moment within yourselves and think about scarcity in some context. Now, it could be that there simply aren't enough people of the gender that you would desire who are unattached, and so that's some kind of reason why you can't just go out and find somebody right away that you want to be with. Think about the amount of money you have in your pocket or in your checking account or wherever, and think about what you can afford and what you can't afford. Try to get a sense of what I mean when I say that money is scarce. And again, I don't mean that there's just, you can't find any. I mean that it's finite. It's not unlimited. By the way, the word infinite is interesting because most people think of the word infinite as unimaginably large, and that's not what it means. Infinite means infinite, not finite, not limited. So infinite means without limit. And I don't think, I would venture to say that none of us consider that money is without limit, or the availability of money in our lives is without limit. So common sense could be described as containing and constraining the possibilities we think of are real for us. No possibility outside the common sense container is real for us. Again, it's not real for me to be able to go out and buy a fleet of airplanes. The idea that I could go out and buy a fleet of airplanes, that's an interesting thing to think about maybe, but it's not real for me. It's not like an option, like something I could choose. So common sense constrains the possibilities that I consider as real for me in my life. Now here's another aspect of common sense. It comes from the dictionary. Common sense means good judgment in practical matters. He has common sense. She has common sense in matters of whatever. So what value is common sense? Well, common sense is useful when you need to get out of a strange room, which is a typical practical matter. So there's a door over there, and it has a handle, right? And your brain has seen that door shape before. It's seen that handle, and maybe you observed a parent opening a door. You absorbed that idea through repetition. When you got big enough to reach the door handle, maybe you tried to open the door. It's like your brain remembers the function of the door and of the handle. If it didn't, you could spend a lot of time pressing against the walls and the windows and objects affixed to those surfaces before you found the handle of the door by accident, and oh, there it is, now it opens. It's real handy to know how that door opens and to know what the handle does. Excuse me, my throat is getting dry here. So we can see that common sense guides our thoughts and that it can be very useful. But of course, what we all know encompasses much more than practical matters. There's also a huge bunch of ideas about life, about ourselves, and about each other. In addition to scarcity, we could examine inevitability, as in illness and aging are inevitable. See, those ideas of scarcity and inevitability, and there are others, are kind of baked into our worldview. We all know that resources are scarce, and we all know that certain things are inevitable, like illness and aging. You know, I'm getting up in years. Some of you are, as I can see, and you might take a moment and think about, well, is illness inevitable? Is decline in physical ability inevitable? Is aging inevitable? I think you'll see that though that idea of inevitability is baked into the way we look at the world. I'm not saying that's not true. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just wanting us to agree that certain principles, certain ideas, certain beliefs are baked into the way we look at the world. So it's that larger aspect of common sense that we're looking at here. And there's an interesting aspect to common sense as it pertains to these larger questions, and that is that common sense changes over time. Here's an example from remote history. In Mesopotamian cosmology, so this is about 3500 BC, so 5.5 millennia ago, the Earth was commonly thought to be a flat disk floating in the sea. So you can see the green in the center of that. That represents the Earth, and it's floating in the sea, and there are pillars that hold the whole thing up, and the sky is in several layers. This is like 5,500 years ago. This is the way people looked at the Earth and the relationship of land to the sea. Now, here's an important point about that. People believed at that time that the horizon was an edge. So that line where the ocean meets the sky was thought to be an edge that you could fall off of. And you could probably imagine how that idea, how that belief could constrain your actions. For example, common sense would have told you how to avoid that. What would common sense have said about that? You can see in this picture that the ships have gotten too close to the edge, and now they're in danger of falling off, or one of them actually is. So what would common sense have told you about that? It would have said, whatever you do, don't sail out beyond the horizon. That's just common sense. That was a principle. That was a way people looked at the world a long time ago, and they never considered whether it was true. It was obvious. It was something that didn't well, what we said earlier was it wasn't grounds for debate. Back in that time, people didn't debate whether that edge was whether that horizon was a real edge. But then the idea of a round earth appeared in Greek philosophy with Pythagoras around 400 BC. So this is like 3,000 years later. And Aristotle performed calculations that showed the spherical shape of the earth by around 330 BC. So now we're, 2,400 years ago. We're getting closer to us, to our time frame. And scientists, at least, are beginning to find out that the earth is round. From then on, knowledge of the spherical earth gradually began to spread beyond the Greek world. It began to be incorporated in normal consciousness, in normal awareness that people had of themselves and their world. Of course, the Flat Earth Society continues to this day to speak of a conspiracy against flat Earth, but we'll leave that be for the time being. Anyway, this was a profound shift. Adopting the idea of the earth as a sphere allowed people to contemplate sailing away from land safely and ultimately allowed the discovery of new continents. So at some point prior to the European expeditions to the New World, some intrepid voyagers got in boats and sailed around and sailed closer to that edge that people believed the horizon was. And lo and behold, they discovered that the horizon moves along with them. And that the closer they got to where they thought the horizon was, the further away the horizon actually was. So it became apparent, to somebody at least, that the horizon is a perceptual thing, it's not a geographical thing or a topographical thing. It's a function of our perception of the angle at which we're looking at the sea, and because the Earth is round, the horizon appears to be a line, and we now in our time know that horizon is not an edge, and that you can sail away from land and without fear of the consequences of your ship falling off the edge. Let's talk about a second example. There was a time when people believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. See, there's the blue Earth in the center, and all the other stuff, Jupiter, Mars, the sun, everything rotates around the Earth. So you could visualize back in 500, 600, 700 years ago, your chores are done, you go out back, you climb the hill, it's nighttime, you lie on your back and you look at the sky, it's clear and you can see maybe the moon or certainly the stars. And if you stay out there long enough, you can see that everything is doing this. And it's certainly common sense that you're standing still, lying still. You have no sensation of movement. And everything else is going around you. Everything in the night sky was thought of as embedded in its own independently rotating shell. So here's a diagram of those shells. And you see the Earth in the center, and all the other stuff in the night sky is in a shell, and they're all independently rotating. But there was a problem with that picture, and that problem was retrograde motion. Though the outer planets clearly travel across the sky, they're observed to reverse direction for periods of time. This seems to conflict with the spherical shell model. So here's a time-lapse photograph. It's actually not time-lapse, it's taken night after night after night. And you can see that Jupiter appears to go backwards for a time. And the idea of the rotating shells forms a context in which that's not explainable. That doesn't fit. This retrograde motion doesn't fit in this idea of spherical shells independently rotating in one direction. When you try to explain retrograde motion with celestial shells surrounding the Earth, you have to add some way to allow the planet to double back on itself. So, Ptolemy, it's pronounced Ptolemy, in the 2nd century AD. So now we're talking about 200 AD, we're talking 1800 and some years ago. He used epicycles to explain the retrograde motion of Jupiter. So Jupiter is on a shell and it's rotating around the Earth, but somehow there's something that allows it to do this. And in a place like this, it appears to retrograde even though the eventual movement is to the west. And there's a principle that says that the simplest explanation for something is probably going to turn out to be the true one. That's a principle that we use a lot. I think it's called Occam's razor. Finally, in the late 1500s, Galileo looked through his telescope at Jupiter's moons and he has a powerful insight. So he can see that these moons are rotating around Jupiter. He can look at this night after night and he can see what's actually going on. And he has this insight that changes everything. The Earth isn't the center of the solar system, the sun is. And now, thinking of the sun at the center solves the problem of retrograde motion much more simply. So the inner circle is the orbit of the Earth, the outer circle is the orbit of Mars, and at 7 different times in the orbits of those planets, it looks like Mars is in retrograde motion. So I put this diagram up on the screen so you can see it more clearly. That's pretty cool, huh? Except now the Catholic Church had a problem. Having the Earth not at the center of things appeared to conflict with core church dogma. The Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, found Galileo vehemently suspect of heresy. in 1615, and he spent the rest of his life under house arrest. He got off easy, though, as Bruno, Giordano Bruno, who was a monk, had been previously tried for his similar heresies, and he got burned at the stake in 1600. So we're making progress from burning at the stake to house arrest. But this is the problem that the Catholic Church had, because they felt that having the earth at the center of everything was somehow more consistent with the Bible, with church dogma. Well, the church finally got over it about 150 years later, and in 1758, the general prohibition against works advocating heliocentrism was dropped. Heliocentrism is a sun-centered solar system. So what lessons about common sense can we draw from these and other examples? So there was the edge, the horizon being an edge, and the earth being at the center. And that common sense at one time held that those were simply truisms that didn't need to be debated. Well, first off, what is thought of as common sense in any particular era usually turns out to be wrong, or at least incomplete, no matter how passionately we defend it. And there were people who passionately defended these ideas. So then, when science has come up with a better, more complete explanation, we find ourselves freed by the constraints imposed by that earlier one. New possibilities reveal themselves, possibilities that couldn't be seen as real under the old view. So, in the 1300s, let's say, or the 1200s, however far we need to go back to consider this, if you are on the west coast of Spain or Portugal, and you stand on a bluff and you're overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, and that horizon out there is a real thing, it's an edge, the possibility that you could get in a boat and sail west simply won't occur to you. It just won't be part of the mix of the possibilities that you can consider as being real for you. You couldn't go to Queen Isabella in Castile, I think it was, and ask for enough money to outfit 3 ships to travel west to discover what's out there, or to get to India, or whatever your idea was. She'd say, "Are you nuts? No doubloons for you." It just wasn't real in that context. Now, if you look at how we acquire it, you can see that common sense is perpetuated as a story about the world that we tell ourselves and our children, often long after science has come up with better explanations for that which we observe. Now, is this inevitable? Does common sense always lag behind scientific understanding? I would say so. And I think I can demonstrate it when we get to the 20th century. See, stories make us feel safe, and we don't let go until we can latch onto another one, which might not be ready yet. So I like this image of the people on a trapeze. You know, you can't let go of whatever you were hanging on to until the person who's ready to catch you is ready to catch you. About the stories, they make us feel safe, and you don't let go of that story until the new story is ready, until the new explanation of why that horizon looks like an edge but isn't is in the culture. It's really hard to let go of the idea that that is an edge. So what does this have to do with us? Our shared common sense view of the world agrees with science, right? I think most of us would consider that in this day and age, and in this Western civilization, well, even Eastern, that we have it together. We know what the world is. We know what a human being is. And our common sense view agrees with science. Most of us would agree with that sentence. But it turns out that 20th century physics produced numerous strange discoveries. So if you take two watches and you synchronize them, and then you take one of them up to the top of Mount Sopris up there and you bring it back, you probably couldn't see it with the naked eye, but those two clocks will no longer agree. That's called gravitational time dilation. The rate at which an atomic clock records time is diminished as gravity increases. This was predicted by Einstein's idea of general relativity, his explanation of what gravity is and how it works. Here's another one. Scientists measure the speed of starlight to be the same, even if they get on a spaceship and zoom towards the star. Now that may not seem strange to you, but let's bring it down to a more practical level. If you get out on the highway and you drive at 50 miles an hour and you notice that somebody is coming at you from the other direction at 50 miles an hour, what's your closing speed going to be? That's right, 100 miles an hour. It's additive. And if you were, God forbid, to collide with that person coming toward you, it would feel like a 100-mile-an-hour crash and not a 50-mile-an-hour crash. So when you're in a car and you approach another vehicle coming towards you, the closing speed, the speed at which you're approaching that other car, is additive. But that doesn't work with starlight, or any light for that matter. If you get on a spaceship and zoom towards that star, you'll still measure the speed of light to be the same as if you were standing still on the surface of the earth. That's not intuitive. That's not common sense. And perhaps strangest of all, a human observer seems to be required in order to turn a myriad of possible realities into just one reality, and that's just not common sense. So this is about quantum physics. This is about quantum physics informs us that a system exists in superposition, that is, in all possible states, until we observe that it is only in one state. And quantum physics has predicted this, and it's been demonstrated over and over again. You know, quantum physics is a really interesting discipline because it turns out to have been enormously useful. In fact, the smartphone that you have in your pocket or in your handbag wouldn't be possible without quantum physics. GPS, all kinds of technologies that we now take for granted would not be possible if quantum physics didn't predict the way the world actually works. And so Richard Feynman, who's one of the great names in 20th century physics, once said, nobody understands quantum physics. In other words, nobody understands in a way we understand the rules of the world and the rules of life and how to get along in life. Nobody understands how the world can be or any system we consider can be in a state of superposition. In other words, simply as a combination of possible states until we observe the system and we see one state. Nobody understands how that's possible. So the broadest, most widely accepted interpretation of quantum physics, which is called the Copenhagen interpretation, has been said to say, just shut up and calculate. Don't worry about it. Just use the theory to design things. And it's been fabulously effective over the last 100 years or so. So it's possible that even now, common sense has not kept up with science. Is that possible? Do you think that's possible? Yeah, a lot of nodding heads. I think it's possible that common sense has not kept up with science, that there are things that we believe that are actually not scientifically demonstrable. And we don't ordinarily notice that. Why not? Well, here's the situation. So last week I gave you the parable of the fish. The fish is born in water. It's never been outside of water. And it doesn't know about water because the way we identify something is to separate it from everything else, to separate it from the background. In other words, let's say you're looking at a painting or a photograph. Like, let's say you're looking at this screen. It's all just color and shape. unless you make the distinction that this is a different drawing from that one. You're separating this out from the background. You're distinguishing it from the background. And that's how we identify and then eventually name objects. We first have to separate them or distinguish them from the background. The fish has been in water its entire life, so it doesn't know about water. It can't distinguish water from anything else. Water is all it knows. See, we don't see our worldview. We just see our world through our worldview or from our worldview. In the case of the fish, whatever he looks at, he's looking at through the water. He's looking at it, he's not looking at the water. He can't look at the water. He just looks at whatever he's looking at, like food or shelter, through the water. He doesn't see his view. He only sees what he's looking at. And we are the same way. We don't know about the assumptions underlying our common sense view of the world because our common sense view of the world is all we've ever known. The way we think about the world and the way we think about our relationship to it is all we've ever known. So we never think about that view. We'll come back to this in a little bit. Okay, let's see if we can find out what assumptions underlie our worldview. Here's a picture of an open, curious guy. He's ready to be exposed to some closer view of his worldview, and we'll look for the assumptions that underlie that worldview. So what does the world consist of? Well, if you ask a scientist what our world consists of, she will probably answer with things like matter and energy and somewhat more abstract things like space-time. We'll talk about that more next in the next workshop next week. But how about if you ask a child? How about if you ask a child, what does the world consist of? He will probably answer with a list of simple objects, each of which has a name. So here we have flower and fly and string and spoon and tree. Each object has a name, and that's what the world consists of to a child. Now, how do you suppose he came by that list? This is a tree, this is a ladder, this is a house. How do you suppose he came by that list? Well, he compiled it as he was taught language. When we teach our children language, we generally start with nouns. This is your nose, this is your ear, this is your milk. So we begin to compile a list of objects of which the world consists, and we are taught the names of those objects in our native language. We all teach our kids language when they're very young. And as we do so, we pass along a description of the world or a story about the world along with the language in which it's expressed. So you see, as we teach our kids language, which we know they need in order to function in the world, we're also conveying to them our description of the world, what we know about the world, our story about the world. And as we grow, that story becomes more and more complex. And gradually, a very interesting thing happens. Our story becomes everything to us. It becomes our world. I love that picture because Le Monde is the name of the newspaper, but it's also the world. Our story becomes everything to us. It becomes our world. Now, what would common sense say about that idea, about the world as story? What would Manny and Frank say about that? Common sense would tell you that the world is pretty much what it appears to be. It would tell you that your story about the world is simply more or less accurate, depending on your intelligence, your education, and perhaps your background. It would find laughable the idea that your world is just a story. Common sense would tell you that you should be focusing your attention instead on success and winning at the game of life. You know, like if you're trying to get more of the good stuff and avoid the bad stuff, You need a strategy, or good judgment in practical matters, which is one of those definitions of common sense. See, our story, common sense, determines what we're able to think. It contains and constrains, limits what we're able to think. All our thoughts must fit inside that boundary, and our strategies for living must conform to those thoughts. Your strategies for getting more of what you want and less of what you don't want are constrained by what you consider as being real. That's true of all of us. If you could solve a problem easily by doing something that common sense tells you is impossible, you won't try it that way. It won't occur to you to try it that way. So we're saying that our story has become and thus limits our world. But what about the real world? The one that just has to be out there beyond the story. There has to be a real world out there that is the way it is when we're not looking at it, or was the way it was before any of us got here, right? There has to be a real world. It can't just, the world can't just be a story. Certainly, our story has to be about the real world. Doesn't that make sense? Well, Albert Einstein believed in a real world. When he was confronted by quantum physics and its conclusion that an observer is required to create a real world from a field of probabilities, he said something like, God does not play dice. He rejected the idea that the real world isn't specific, isn't definable, isn't describable as objects in space and time. He rejected that idea. His mind, as incredible as it was, refused to consider that possibility. But what, if anything, can we know about a real world that may lie beyond our story, our interpretation? What can we know about a real world that our stories are stories about? What can we know about what's out there, whether we're telling stories about it or not? See, here's the problem. We live inside of our story, like the fish lives inside of water that it doesn't see. It's a story about the objects we encounter and the events we witness. It's a story about what those objects and events mean, whether they're good or bad, and whether we like them or not. That's our story. It's also a story about why things happen. That's called, of course, cause and effect. It's an interpretation of reality and not reality itself. We never experience that real world directly. To the degree to which we're all stuck in the idea that there has to be a real world out there that is the way it is, whether we're looking at it or not, we never experience that real world, whatever it might be, directly. What we experience is our story about the world, our interpretation of the information provided to us by our senses. All we really know about the world is how it behaves when we interact with it. So we're interacting with this object by receiving the light that bounces off it. How it appears when we look at it, how it sounds when we listen to it, how it feels to the touch, and so on. That's really all we know, is how the world behaves when we interact with it. We know what we know about the world in order to maximize our chances for successful lives, in order to survive and procreate. Once again, we're saying that our worldview is a story. It's acquired and developed as we learned language. That's all we have, and that's just not common sense. See, what we know about the world is formed out of what our senses deliver to our brains. So back to that image of vision. The light that enters your eye gets converted to a series of electrical impulses that travel along your optic nerve to the brain And your brain makes a picture out of those electrical impulses. It's very much like a television. You know, in the old days, now this is the really old days. When I was in high school, I had a television that was about that tall, and it was black and white. I'm dating myself here, and some of you may be doing that as well. But the idea of television at the time was you had a setting, you had a set, you know, like a made-up dining room or something like that, or you had a football game or a baseball game or something like that, and you had a camera pointed at that set, at that game. And so the light that bounced off whatever whatever the camera was pointed at entered the camera. It was converted to electrical impulses, which got transmitted to your television and reassembled or decoded, some word like that, into a picture that you could see. And so it was like simulating looking at whatever the camera was pointed at. Nowadays, of course, we have all experienced seeing things on our screens that have no counterpart in real life. There was no camera, and it was not pointed at anything real. It was all created by computers, CGI, and we've all seen animated features where everything is created through software and has no basis in real life. So your brain, back to your brain is creating a picture of the world out of electrical impulses, and you have no way of getting outside of that construct in order to see the real world that you're supposedly seeing with your eyes. So look at whatever's in front of you, whatever you see right now, me or the screen or whatever. Look at it and see if you can get the idea. Whether or not it's true is aside or beside the point. See if you can get the idea that what you're looking at is a picture in your brain and not the world. And then if you were to get up now and move around this room, you would be moving around, you would be walking around in your pictures of the world when you think you're walking around in the world. Can you get that? It's like you have no way, you and I have no way of getting outside of that whole thing to see if there really is a world out there that your pictures, your story, your interpretation of those electrical impulses is about. We humans don't have access to the real world. We only have access to the pictures we have about it. And those pictures are the result of having been taught about the world when we learned language. It's an acquired skill to picture the world and to picture it in such a way that we can all agree enough about it to talk and argue about it. So, let me go back a slide. The idea that all we have is our pictures is just not common sense. But my question is it supported by science? See, a while back we said that common sense doesn't keep up with science. 20th century physics showed us that our ideas about the world are only valid in a narrow human frame of reference. So, objects that move relative to another in human terms, like 50 or 60 miles an hour, those speeds, or 100 miles an hour if you're a batter and the pitcher throws a baseball at the plate or at the catcher, whatever. Those are human dimensions. Those speeds are human dimensions. We can't attain, most of us will never have the experience of attaining a speed relative to the Earth at which, for example, the twin paradox would come into our human awareness. The twin paradox is where you have a pair of twins and one of them gets on a spaceship and travels around at a very high rate of speed and comes back and is younger than the twin that stayed on Earth. And relativity, general relativity tells us, special relativity tells us that that's the case. And we have observed that in carefully controlled experiments. But in the normal human realm, we don't see that, the narrow frame of human reference. So among the aspects of what we all know that aren't supported by science are our ideas about space and time and matter and gravity and cause and effect. All of those things are now different in the light of 20th century physics from what we all know. What we all know is that time is just a construct. It's just a succession of events. It's a framework in which events take place. Space is a framework in which objects reside. It's just an abstract idea. It's just fixed. It doesn't. But what we've discovered, what Einstein discovered over 100 years ago, is that time and space have their own dynamics. They shrink, they expand according to motion. Time changes according to the strength of the gravitational field. Remember, I referred to earlier, if you take two watches and synchronize them and one goes up to the top of the mountain and comes back, it won't read the same as the other one. So, among the aspects of what we all know that aren't supported by science are our ideas about space and time and matter and gravity and cause and effect. In other words, pretty much everything. Does our metaphorical fish just need to tweak her understanding of water? You could say that the basic assumption underlying her worldview is that water is everything, but it's not. And there is one basic assumption that underlies our entire worldview. And let me see if I can get at it for you. I'm going to do a little reference to Shakespeare here. In his play, As You Like It, the character Jacques says, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances." He's saying that the world is the persistent background and that we are transient players in the foreground. He's saying that we creatures come and go and the world remains. That's just common sense, right? We all think of it that way. We all think of the world that way. It's permanent and we come and go. We know that we were born. We know that we will die. We see people come and go. We see people come into the world and leave it. We all know that the world is the persistent background and we are the ones who come and go. But quantum physics has found that reality exists only as a field of possibilities until each one of us settles on one possibility and makes it real. What if that's what it is to be a human being? What if a human being is that which brings one of many possible worlds into actuality? What if the persistent background is simply consciousness, and what we are is simply consciousness individualized in the world? If that's the case, we have to exchange the foreground for the background. So you've probably all seen this diagram. It doesn't matter whether the first thing you see is a chalice or two profiles facing one another. You can go back and forth between those two views so that the white is the background and the chalice, the black chalice, is the foreground, okay? Or the other view is that the black is the background and these two profiles are facing one another. That's exchanging the foreground for the background, and we can do that easily. The metaphor to which that diagram that points is that we are the stage on which life plays out. We are the source of our own reality. All else is temporary. So that means that our awareness, our consciousness is the persistent background, and it's the world that appears against that background. It's an inversion of the foreground and the background. Remember Manny and Frank, our two regular guys? They have a common sense approach to life. They've done well for themselves without remembering who they really are. But then they'll remember when they wake up from these roles they came here to play. Imagine what else they're capable of if they wake up while they're still here. We have an opportunity to awaken to a different reality, a separate reality from the reality that we've all known all our lives. That reality is at bottom that the world is the context in which we live our lives, that it's permanent and we come and go. We have the ability to invert that view and to adopt a different way of looking at our being with respect to the world, and consider ourselves as individualizations of consciousness in which the world appears, in which what we consider the world, which are the pictures that are formed from electrical impulses within us, in which those objects constitute a world that appears against the background of awareness or consciousness. So that's the end of tonight's presentation. I want to let you know what to expect for next week. We're going to talk about physics and spirituality. So the questions I'll ask are what is spirituality, and can spirituality and physics coexist? And how and if physics can illuminate what a human being really is.